Yeah, the call of wild's always bringing me home. Call of wild's always bringing me home. Call of wild's always bringing me home.
Hello, wild ones. Welcome to another episode of the Find Your Wild podcast. I'm very excited to have Cheryl Alexander here. Probably know her as well, associated with Takaya, the lone wolf of Canada. How are you doing today?
Hi, Brianna. I'm great. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast.
I'm very excited it worked out. I know we've been back and forth a little bit, so I know it's hard to make the time. So I really appreciate you doing that and coming on today. And I've been looking forward to chatting with you.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I also want to add that you're a conservationist, a photographer, a wildlife. Would you say survivalist expert?
Well, I used to, many years ago, I ran Outward Bound programs for young offenders and I taught wilderness survival. I spent a lot of time in the wilderness through most of my life, on sea and on land. And so, yeah, I'm not a survivalist.
Okay.
I think that has a different connotation.
Yes, yes. So you taught survival skills and
Yes.
know a couple of those things, right? Yeah.
Wilderness survival skills. Like how do you die when you're in the wilderness? Or
Yes. I know, was it this summer you had a scare where you fell and you had to be rescued off of the island? That must have been tough, right?
yeah, that was actually very shocking to me. It had never happened in all of my time in the wilds, and it just shows how easily something can happen. I was just doing a pretty simple hike in a fairly remote location and slipped, and my knee came down on a root right in the wrong spot, and I severed my tendon, a
Yeah.
patellar tendon, and I could not move. And the pain was incredible, and eventually had to get rescued by our amazing search and rescue teams that we have here in BC. It involved 8 people on a team and transport out, and then Coast Guard. So yeah, it was. I've just started to recover from that actually.
I was gonna say that's a long recovery with your knee, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Able to walk
Well,
again. Yay.
that's amazing. Well, I'm very happy for your recovery and so glad that everything ended up working out. But I loved your humbleness on being like, see, I've been in the wilds for so long and it can really happen to anyone. So to just be careful and, give yourself grace and be humble because you never know what could happen, a root pops up and, takes you out.
That's very true. But to add to that, um, encourage people always to just get out there and be in the wilderness or in nature in whatever way you can. It doesn't have to be wilderness. It can be your parks, which are amazing and
Yeah.
currently sadly under threat. And it can just be your backyard where you're bathed in the sort of natural world. And I think that's very healing, and people need it right now because it's a time of great anxiety. So get out there.
Yeah.
And don't worry
It's
about falling.
of course, right. Yeah. I mean, it's more of just that and I love that sentiment of it, anywhere you could just be in your own backyard and absorbing nature, but yeah, I mean, obviously to start that off, don't be scared of nature. I know I just told a scary story, but I think that also that was the first time something like that had ever happened and you've been out in the wilds for how long, right? So
Yeah.
just obviously to just be careful, but like, there's science behind being able to be in nature and hearing bird song is good for your health and people go forest bathing and the science backs being connected to nature. So to find that in any way that feels comfortable to you, maybe one day that's in your backyard, maybe the next day you're feeling adventurous and want to go check out the forest or the ocean. So yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I would love to. So, uh, I guess to kind of jump into Takaya and your relationship with him, how did that relationship first begin?
So I'm not even sure if your audience, people who are listening to this podcast, know anything about Takaya. So I'll just give a tiny bit of background. He is what's known as a coastal sea wolf. It's essentially he's a gray wolf, but has adapted to life on the coast and swimming in the sea, basically, and getting a lot of his food from the sea. So I live on Vancouver Island, which is off the coast of BC, and actually off the coast of the US, Washington State. So I look across at the States, San Juan Island. And
Mhm.
Takea, this wolf, came in 2012. To this small group of islands that is near me, and it's an archipelago, and it's not inhabited. But strangely, it also did not have any deer, elk, small mammals, moose, nothing that was considered normal prey for wolves. He ended
Right.
up in these islands. He chose to stay there we're not sure why. He ended up living there for 8 years by himself. So there were no other wolves, and the only thing really he had to eat was seal. So I mean, there were a few other things, but his primary diet was harbor seal.
Yeah.
I live near there, and I've been out to these islands most of my life, and was shocked to hear that there was a wolf on these islands. And when I eventually saw him, I had an encounter that was very impactful. Uh, and looking into his eyes, hearing his howl, something uh, deep inside me reached out to him. And all of a sudden, from knowing really essentially nothing about wolves, they're very hard to see. I had never seen one in the wild, even though I spent a lot of time in wilderness. Um, I I was incredibly moved by his existence and by his energy, and it started a whole train of things in my life that I didn't expect.
Yeah, that's a beautiful background story for that. And just to I guess ask, how big are those islands? Is like does the main island, is that called Discovery Island?
Yeah,
So how big is that around?
tiny. The whole area of the all of the islands, and there's about four biggish ones and a bunch of small ones and rocky outcrops, etc.,
Right.
is probably less than 2 square kilometers.
Wow. Wow.
Mhm.
Amazing. And he stayed there for what, like eight years or so? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He lived there for 8 years, and he was incredibly healthy. I think, because he ate seal, he had this really great coat, shiny, lots of oil in his
Yeah.
diet, lots of omega 3s.
Right.
Yeah, he swam there in 2012 and didn't leave until 2020.
Wow. So that's a long time. And so your beginning journey of how you found him is you spend a lot of your time just watching him from your boat, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a so it took me a while to even actually see him or find him. If he's not on the coast, if he was inland at all, you'd never see him or know. And he was also extremely camouflaged. So he could be laying on the coast or on a bluff, and most people would not see him. So after I saw him the first couple of times, I just was struck by his life out there, especially being alone. And I knew I needed to find out more about his life. And so slowly I started going out in my boat. I got better over the years at finding him. Eventually, I almost had a sixth sense of where he was, because I never knew which island even he was going to be on. So he could have been on any one of a number of islands. He swam back and forth between these islands almost daily, probably. It was his territory. So yeah, it just I just slowly started learning about his life, and the more I learned, the more captured I was, and actually inspired is probably the right word. Inspired by the life and the way he was able to survive on his own. Um, so I was started to document him and photograph him and eventually film his life. And I think I became for him possibly a connection to another sentient being
Yeah.
because I was consistent in his world, and he did not. Once he came to know me that I was not a threat, he just carried on with his life.
Yeah, as an equal, right? In some regards, like you're not prey, you're not in my necessarily someone that's gonna take over my territory, right? But he learned from you just respecting your distance and uh being able to have that connection there. I heard there was one time like or maybe a couple where he was able to get so comfortable that he was on his back in front of you.
Yeah, lots of times. That was the first time, actually. It happened about a few months after I started to be out there a lot. And I would often just anchor my boat, out in the water. So I was often a fair ways from him, but I would just be there. And as he slowly got to know my scent, he would sniff in the air and then he would be comfortable. And the first time I realized that he was really trusted me was when I was anchored just off and um, came out. He had hidden because a bunch of kayakers had gone past. He had gone back in the grass, laid down, and was sort of just watching them. And then when they passed, he came back out and he laid down and he rolled on his back and he put his legs in the air. And I thought, wow, he does trust me because it is a very vulnerable position to be in.
Right. And we can relate to like when our dogs do that at home, they can only do that when they're very, very comfortable. So, I think that's one of the cool things about respecting wildlife and letting them kind of, do their own thing. Cause then you get moments like this where, it's such a beautiful and almost magical moment where like you get the trust of this wild animal and it's just through respect, of each other.
Yeah, and I think he if we were ever close, occasionally I was on land and would be close nearby, but it was always within his defined boundaries, sense of what was he was comfortable with. And sometimes I would all of a sudden feel that there was a presence behind me and I might look around and he was laying in the bush just nearby. That
Mhm.
was his choice to come and be
Right.
near me. I I I respected his boundaries. So I think that increased the level of trust. And honestly, if he was not comfortable with someone, he would sometimes he did very funny things. Sometimes he'd just turn his back. It was like, if I don't see you, you're not there. If other people were down on their boat, sometimes whale watchers would come by and would be looking for him, and if he would be way up on a bluff, so quite far away, but if he didn't want to be part of what they were doing, he would just turn around and lay back down. And yeah, he could disappear in a second if he didn't want to be around anyone.
Yeah, and I'll include some pictures for people listening so they can see what he looked like. But I mean, what a beautiful wolf, like you were saying. I mean, his coloration was striking, and especially like the darker parts, like up here, like was it really just so gorgeous. And those sea wolves have that kind of brownie uh additive that aren't like, as white. Like it's really striking, and he really blended in so well, so he could really disappear
Yeah.
very easily, right?
Yeah, yeah, he was a beautiful wolf, and his coloration was remarkable. The sea wolves often have, especially this very reddish behind their ears, and they blend in with the intertidal. He blended in actually very well with on in his territory. There were a lot of arbutus trees in the U.S. I think you call them madrona
Okay.
trees, and they have super red, auburny colored bark, and his ears were very much the same color. So, yeah, he was quite striking laying underneath these arbutus trees.
Yeah, absolutely gorgeous. I mean, the perfect picture of the Pacific Northwest with the wild aspect and the trees and the coast. Um, so or would British Columbia that's a little further up. So I don't know if that is technically even though you look at the Salish Sea, would you guys consider yourselves a
Oh
still
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I didn't know if that was the proper terminology
Oh, it
still.
is the yeah, it is the
Okay.
proper term. It used to be the Strait of Juan. Well, it is still is the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but the whole area is called the Salish Sea. And
Got
actually, Takaya was almost like a sentinel at the entrance to the Salish Sea because
it.
he these islands are right where the Strait of Juan de Fuca comes in from the Pacific and turns into the Salish Sea.
Oh wow, how beautiful. And I know are there so there are other sea wolves. Do you know where they are in relation to where he was?
Mhm. Yes, there are a number of sea wolves on Vancouver Island. They also go up the coast of British Columbia and even into Alaska. So the ones on Vancouver Island, there's probably they honestly don't have a good estimate of population currently, but the guess is there's about 250 maybe on Vancouver Island. And to give you a sense, Vancouver Island is about the same size as England is. So
Oh wow.
it's very
Yeah.
large. It's a large island. And there are a lot of areas of wilderness, especially along the west coast of the island, which is where a lot of these wolves will live. So there's a pack that's that's on the other side of Victoria, in a sort of slightly wilder area, and that would be I don't know from where he was through. It would be going through the whole city, like
Mhm.
it's on the other side of the city. So
Wow.
he yeah.
Yeah, it's obviously still a mystery of how he even got there, where he came from. So, do we know if he came from maybe those, or there's not really that much information about those sea wolves either, right?
No, we don't know. I was very curious to try and do some DNA analysis and find out where he came from. Unfortunately, there's not enough data to even compare his DNA with.
Right.
So it's very possible he came from there. From it's called Souk, an area sort of to the west of Victoria, Port Renfrew area, and up the West Coast Trail. It's possible he came from further up north.
Mm.
There's an island called Nuka Island that has a healthy sea wolf population, and I have actually seen those wolves look very, very similar to Takaya, and it's very possible he came from there. Wolves will go long distances when they're looking for new territory, and he could have even come realistically from hundreds of kilometers away, or maybe even from the mainland.
Right. Yeah, so there's a couple of different theories and options that it could have been, but we
And
will
we'll never know.
we'll
Yeah.
never know. But that's okay because his story I think is pretty impactful and amazing, and it's truly beautiful, looking at your Instagram and how many people have really been inspired by his story. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. She probably sees a squirrel outside. Uh, so, but it's beautiful, the artwork, the poetry, the writing, so many people being inspired. And there's uh there's a couple of artworks that right. Is there an artwork now on Discovery Island for Takaya?
Yeah,
Oh,
they're a fabulous local muralist snuck out there and did this incredible, huge painting of Takaya on an abandoned wall of an abandoned lighthouse. And he did it so it looks like the wolf is laying on the rocks that are
Wow.
just under. So a lot of people go out to see that. There's another sculpture, which is just a cutout outline of him running along the bluff. So those are both out on the islands. And then there's a very large marble sculpture which has been erected in his honor on a point of Victoria, which is it's a park, and it looks across at the islands.
Beautiful.
And yeah, there's sculptures, there's hundreds of paintings, and um, jewelry, and just I mean, you name it, and it's come from all over the world.
Yeah.
Many different countries. About 20 countries are represented in the artwork that has been produced as tribute to Takaya.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I want to go back, I guess, because but just like for people listening to kind of get the pieces of the full story. So, um, you documented him for 8 years. I also wanted to mention too that you went to the local indigenous tribe to get permission to be able to be on the lands, right?
Hmm. Yes. When I mean, I just started off photographing him. And
Right.
then when I realized that it probably should be documented with video, which I didn't really know how to do, I thought that I should video it. So I started to learn a little bit, and then realized that actually it would make a very amazing film to document the life of this wolf. And some of the land out there is First Nations reservation land. So I went to the First Nations whose land it is, traditional territory, and asked for permission and for their involvement in making a film about it. So the film slowly evolved, and I was actually determined not to put anything out. I didn't talk about what I was doing. I didn't put it out publicly. Uh, I thought I would wait until he was no longer there because I honestly was very worried that it would be dangerous for him.
Yeah.
And so I can tell you if you're interested about why that changed from me or when that changed.
Please, I would love to hear that. Yeah.
Um, it was in 2016, so I had been since 2014. It had been a couple of years of documenting him, and I had been working with a filmmaker, and uh, then something happened on the island, which was a couple of people, guys, I think, and a couple of their 12-year-old kids and some dogs, I think two dogs or three dogs. Excuse me. It was never fully disclosed what had happened, but these people were on the island, and the parks had put up there's a provincial park out there, so the parks had, when the wolf arrived, had put up signs, no dogs allowed on the island. These people took the dogs, were having a hike, and they encountered the wolf. It's kind of funny, the sort of picture of how they encountered him. Apparently they had hiked out to this abandoned lighthouse and were hiking back to where their boat was, and looked behind them, and there were not just their two dogs, but a third. And it was the wolf walking along behind their dogs, obviously very interested in his fellow canines.
Right.
These people freaked out, didn't know anything much about wolves, and thought it was very dangerous. And so they turned around and went back to the lighthouse, and they climbed up on top through a ladder on the wall, on top of one of the lighthouse buildings, the Foghorn Building, and they radioed for help to the Canadian Coast Guard. No, I mean, you have to sort of picture this. The 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 there was a very large Canadian Coast Guard ship nearby, and so they came to the aid of these people, sent in armed fisheries officials who happened to be on the boat in a Zodiac to rescue these people who were up on top of the lighthouse. By this time, the wolf was gone. And but what happened as a result of that is they closed the island, parks did, closed the park, and they said that they were going to assess whether he was habituated and a danger to people. Unfortunately, the parks had very limited ability to do any kind of research whatsoever, and they when I contacted them to say, look, I can give you lots of information about this wolf. I've been documenting him. He's not habituated. He's not a danger to people. He lives his own life out there. I said, what are you going to do? And they said, well, if we decide he's habituated, we're going to use what we call lethal control, which is they were going to shoot him. So at that point, I realized that actually he probably was going to be safer from the authorities, who were maybe the most threat to him, if more people knew about him and about how amazing he was and would be willing to stand up if the authorities decided to shoot him. So that was the pivotal point for me of deciding to then speak out about him and what he was like and what his life was like.
Yeah, and I think to hone in on the importance of the story of individuals, which I think is one of my biggest takeaways from the story of Takaya, is this journey of this individual wolf. And I was talking to my friend Rachel Tilseth, who did the documentary People and Wolves. But there's also this, and she brought it up very nicely, that for conservation purposes, it's so important to have these individual stories. And thank goodness you were there to document and really see the true him and know it was because he was probably very lonely. And how many other times has he even seen another, canid around to, be curious about? And clearly was not a threat. So you were able to speak on his behalf. But I just think that the story, especially of individual animals, and it's not always easy to know because you said like you've been out in the wilderness for so long and had never seen a wild wolf. So it's not always an easy thing. But when we do have these individual stories and are able to hear their whole history, it's really important to also to the conservation of their whole species.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It is, and it's what I've actually been dedicating my last 5 years to, is to getting the story of Takaya out so that people understand that he was an individual, sentient being. So is every other wolf. So is actually
Right.
probably every other animal. And we until we start to understand through our hearts and minds about the value of individual animals, we often refer to them as populations, which takes away the significance of us in our heart understanding who these creatures are and what their potential value is. So it makes it harder to press ahead with killing them, especially in ways that are not humane,
Right.
as is currently happening in both my country and your country. So
Yeah.
there's lots of Romeo, the wolf from Alaska, is another example of a wolf that became known. His character, his being who he was, became known because people observed him and documented him. And there have been only a few wolves throughout history that people have actually come to know as individuals. I feel like I was given this incredible gift of a connection with a wild wolf. And so my gift to people has been to share it, to share that story and hope that people can begin to see and understand, especially wolves, differently.
Yeah, it's often described as wolves having, you either absolutely love them or for some reason you absolutely hate them. For people that hate them, they use terms like vermin, or like you said, like populations, and like there are just so many misconceptions. And also to talk about like your point of value, it's been throughout history, we as humans have had this ego, over eco, right? As, or at least it started out that way, and then over time changed. And we had perceived animals as just the value of, like, what are they valuing to me? How can this animal be of value to me? And not just that animal is, like you said, a sentient being, and it has ecological importance that is of value to Mother Nature. It doesn't have to necessarily have a specific value to us. And again, that goes against the ego versus eco thing. How we can humble ourselves. And I always say that, caring for the environment and the animals is an innately spiritual thing. That connection. So to love and to be a storyteller, for Takaya, and to spread awareness for wolves everywhere. I'm sure you feel is such an honor.
Yeah, it's an honor, and it also feels like a responsibility because
I'm sure, yeah.
we still have what is a human anthropocentric attitude toward animals, wild animals particularly, and it's one in which we think we have to control what happens, that we get to manage them. The North American model of wildlife management is exactly that. Like, well,
Right.
what are they doing to us, and what can we do to them, and how have we got to manage their populations? Wolves don't need to be managed generally. They manage their own populations. They are not animals that are out of control on the landscape generally. It's not to say that there isn't occasionally maybe a
Sure.
problem with a wolf, but certainly the scapegoating that goes on right now in terms of people, for example, what has happened recently in your country where a person ran over a female wolf with his snowmobile, and
Yeah.
felt that that was okay, and that he could take this poor animal who wasn't yet dead and tape her mouth and take her to the local bar where everyone kicked her and kissed her and made fun of
Yeah.
her, and then he took her out and shot her, and there was no consequences for this. So that kind of behavior speaks to a broken spiritual connection with our environment and with the animals that we have to share the earth with, and not only have to, but it is essential to our functioning ecosystems that we have these apex predators in our world. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. I remember listening to when Diane Boyd was just on Joe Rogan and talking about, the how what you were talking about, how wolves generally manage themselves, and them being a keystone species and also predators. They're not overpopulating like elk are, and why they're actually so important to the elk population. And when people say like things like, oh, they're decimating the elk population, it's not true. Like, it takes so much effort for them to even go and make a kill as a pack, and they usually only take the sick, and they get rid of the dying. So it really creates this balance that people are not realizing, why they are so important to the environment. And that they generally also, most times when wolves die naturally, they're killed by other wolves. And we see that especially in Yellowstone, which I know you were just there as well. But yeah, so that's
Yeah.
why I feel like, yeah.
The scapegoating of wolves is unfortunately, it's in the States, it's in Canada, it's in Europe, and people are come up against how can we coexist with these apex predators that they worry are taking the deer they themselves want to hunt, or the elk they want to hunt, or farmers and ranchers are worried that they will take some of their animals. First of all, if you look at the statistics behind that, it just simply is minuscule. What a rancher loses to a wolf compared to what he loses to climate change, to
Right.
disease, to being lost, to
Right. To weather.
to you know.
Yeah.
And yet wolves provide somehow a simple scapegoat that we have to manage their populations.
Hi, wild ones. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Find Your Wild podcast. This episode is brought to you by my clothing brand Femme Sauvage, and I'm going to link that in the description below, along with a little discount code for you. Be sure to check it out. We also donate $5 with each of our animal designs towards specific charities. I will also have those in the description below. And enjoy the rest of the episode. Thanks so much for listening.
We had a situation here where the minister in charge of the wildlife area in BC, when asked to review the regulations, the recreational hunting regulations that allow any hunter to go kill as many wolves as they want, generally in BC, she said, "Oh well, we know wolves aren't endangered because they breed like a bunch of rabbits." Well,
It's not true.
false. Not true.
Yeah.
Just simply not true. They don't breed like
Right.
rabbits. So that's an example of the extreme ignorance, even of people who are ultimately responsible for the management of our wilderness and wild places and wildlife.
It's so unfortunate. And is there any update on that? Like there any movement on changing that law by you, or that it's at a standstill?
It's at a standstill, I would say. We did make after the first year. So I don't know if your listeners know yet that Takaya was eventually shot by a trophy hunter. He was a cougar trophy hunter, and the the reaction to that by many people was extreme anger and also determination that these regulations, which allowed that to be considered legal, needed to be reviewed and revised. So we, for a couple of years, had a lot of action, petitions, resolutions from municipalities requesting the government to revise and review these recreational hunting regulations. Well, that didn't go very far because basically the government just ignored it, and they ended up changing government a few times as well and revising structures, and so it kind of got stalled out. So I then went for more sort of general education, which is what I've been spending a lot of my time over the last few years doing, is trying to give talks and introduce people to Takaya and to the issues around wolves.
Yeah, I feel like you've done such a good job really expanding his legacy and adding to that, and making his death not in vain, I'm sure. Like you would say. And so I want to also, I guess, like for people listening, to go back a little bit to lead them on the journey of how that ended up happening. So this was in 2020, and he left the island of his own volition and went to Victoria.
Yeah, we don't even know really if he left on his own volition. We know he ended up in Victoria, in the city. How that happened is, again, something we will probably never know. If he left on his own, why did he do that? Maybe it was because he wanted to find a mate, although he was quite old for a wolf. And you think if he hadn't done it in the previous 8 years, why would he do it now? But maybe he just got to the point where he'd had it. He also, I really worried that he was lonely and just got to the point of I need a bit of contact with people because I had not been out there for a few months. It was winter. There was tons of storms. No one would have been out there
Right.
during that time. And it's also possible he got swept away. There's very strong currents around these islands. And because he swam back and forth, maybe he made a mistake and couldn't, they're 5 knot currents. So and
Yeah.
they would have swept him toward the city at a significant rate. He may not have been able to swim back against it at that point.
Sure.
So anyway, there's lots of reasons. Maybe something happened that scared him on the island. There was a hunter who went out there and was hunted illegally and was shooting ducks, and maybe he got too close to the wolf. So don't know, won't know, but for whatever reason, he ended up in the city of Victoria, like deep in the city of Victoria. So he was down around the Parliament buildings and the inner harbor and the big hotels and
Yeah, I
yeah.
saw a couple of the videos, and it was really sad too because he looked very scared. He looked like he was trying to find his way, and he seemed very lost.
Yeah, he seemed like he was on a mission, and the mission was probably get me out of here.
Yeah,
And yet he didn't seem to know how to do that, which is odd in a way, but again, don't really understand why.
right.
Fortunately for him, in BC, the government conservation department, their approach, if a carnivore, if a apex predator like a cougar, you call them mountain lions, or a wolf, or some other animal that shouldn't be in the city ends up in it, they will generally kill it. They don't relocate. But in Takaya's case, they did, because he had become very well known. The film had come out before that, and people locally knew about him. And so there was quite a great outcry not to shoot this wolf because we were pretty sure it was Takaya. So in fact, they didn't. They tranquilized him, and then they opted to relocate him. My reaction to that was that was absolutely what they should not have done. They
Yeah,
should have taken him back to his territory. He was an old wolf. To put him out in an area where there were other wolf packs, there were hunters, trappers, cars, people, and also none of his normal prey. So that's what they
it
did.
was.
Took him
Yeah,
out to this area, served to the west of Victoria, and released him there in the middle of winter.
yeah. So the everything was unfortunately really fighting against him with all of those kind of odds, and just to, wolves in their territories, they're very territorial animals. I mean, 907F, one of the also famous wolves in Yellowstone, who was also like 11 and a half, she died from another wolf. I'm sure squabbling over territory. So that's very dangerous territory, especially for a lone wolf, especially for an older wolf, and to not really know where he is. So I that makes sense as to why I would see that probably wasn't the best option, and it very unfortunately, led to him being shot.
Yeah, what's interesting to me about what happened? Well, first of all, he lived for 2 months out there, and I actually did
Right.
know quite a bit about his life. And he was actually surviving, and he was learning to hunt beaver and different kind of prey. And he had chosen a spot to stay that was in between two wolf pack territories. So
Mhm.
I think he had kind of figured out maybe this is where I can survive a little bit. But also, the many stories about dogs, particularly and cats making their way back home over long periods, like over great distances.
Yes.
And people often talk about, well, I don't know how do they do that? I think Takaya was heading back to his territory. And so he had traveled 50 kilometers one direction toward his territory. And I think he came across, it's an area where there are other wolf packs. And he would have known that from the scent marking, etc. Turned around, went back to where he had been released, and then the next day turned around and went 50 kilometers the other direction, which also took him back toward his territory. So
Mm,
where he was shot, I believe he was trying to get back to his home.
yeah. And I'm so sorry also for that loss because I can't imagine you know, being with him, documenting him, building up the time and respect to be able to have this connection and bond with him and have that happen, I'm sure was devastating.
Yeah, he felt like part of my family. I knew him so well, and to have him shot and um, immediately his head and paws were chopped off. Uh, he was being prepared to go to a taxidermist to be to be a mount to be mounted, and it was the whole thing was just uh, incredibly distressing and sickening.
Yeah, and I'm sure traumatic to say the least. Um, and I'm so sorry for that. And the what you've done in the opposite of all that cruelty to make his legacy so beautiful and profound. I'm sure his spirit surrounds you and the islands and um I on my spiritual side I secretly hope that he reincarnates and finds a mate in another life because that was the biggest thing that people were hoping for, that that romantic side, right, for him to have found a mate, but obviously that did not, unfortunately, happen.
Yeah, it was. I think people all over who knew his story really wanted him to find a mate, and we have an empathy with people who are alone and lonely, or creatures who are. You want them to not feel that loneliness, and he howled all the time, especially during mating season for wolves. His
Yeah,
howling was even more, and it was just poignant that this animal who was doing very well by himself, but still longing. So, yeah, that I one of the really amazing things was that just in the end of our filming, um, another wolf did come along. And it was quite incredible because the chance of other wolves coming into this area are very slim. And we think it was a young female, and she ended up on the point of land right across from the islands.
uh,
And she didn't swim across, and we don't know why. But there was this hope that, oh my God, like a young
so
female,
close. Yeah,
so close, so far.
yeah.
I have to plug my laptop in, or
Oh,
it's
sure, no problem.
it just gave me the thing it was about to die.
No problem. I know I've learned my lesson the hard way.
There you go. It's done.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, and it's funny too. I don't know, a thought comes up that because we relate so much to when animals are lonely, but especially wolves, because we've had that ancient connection with them. And I think I was telling you before we jumped on, my friend David, how, and he studied that, the ancient relationship between wolves and humans, and he was describing it as wolves were like the best partners in our landscape because we had such similar hunting styles, and we're really so similar in so many ways. And I just recorded with Edith Leoso the other day, who was on um Rachel Tilset's film, and she's of Ojibwe descent, so she's native to Wisconsin. Um, and she was talking, and she very beautifully describes the relationship that their stories tell of the Mayangan. That's what they call the wolves there, and that's a part of their stories, their legends. About the wolves being their brethren, and that innate connection that they have, and that they have over time seen, when the wolf hunts happened in Wisconsin, that they were killing pregnant wolves, and there were pregnant women that were also dying, and that the main focus of that is whatever happens to them will happen to you, and that you're supposed to take care of them. And they're doing a lot to try to combat that, but obviously there's unfortunately a lot that's against them right now.
Yeah, I completely agree. From my experience being connected to a wolf, which I did not expect. It was a very deep heart connection. It felt like
Mhm.
it opened up something in me that was ancient, that
Yeah,
was something that I learned about myself, and my very deep connection to the earth, and probably to wolves in our early life, where in our early human development, where we did run alongside each other. And there are many people now who believe and have started to study the connection between wolves and humans in the early days, and feel that we even learned how to hunt from wolves. That
makes sense to me.
and how they became the domesticated animals, that some became our dogs. And so, and many people will say that wolves are the closest to humans in terms of their family orientation, their loyalty to their young. Uh, they're extremely is significant in our human development. So
Yeah.
it's not a surprise that some people will feel very connected to wolves, and other people will hate them.
Yeah. And it really takes sometimes having a personal connection to maybe trying to change people's minds, or what you're, telling with the story of Takaya. And hopefully it's been a very uphill battle, right? And it feels like sometimes you don't see the end of how this could work out, but to really change people's minds on showcasing how intricately connected we are to wolves, and how they're such family animals too, um, and so intelligent. And like when you're killing a wolf, like that individual is so important, right? Like what we were talking about, that is, a mom, they all have such an important role in their pack. So when you're killing one, you're killing, that pack could deform. You could kill all of them by killing one. Um, and like we said, the wolves are territorial, and like, for them to even integrate or find another pack could be hard. So there's a lot of intricacies that people don't realize too.
Yeah, I mean, just as an example, here in BC, we have recreational hunting, which allows hunters to just who have a standard license to kill a wolf if they decide to, for no reason. You need no tag, special tag to kill a wolf. You do if you want to kill a deer or an elk or a bear or anything, but
So
not a
weird.
wolf. So weird.
Yeah.
So archaic.
Yeah.
But the other thing we have here is a wolf call, which ostensibly is justified by needing to protect the mountain caribou. It's a very long story, which I won't get into, the science of the caribous and the threatened extinction of them, the mountain caribou, and the wolves. But one of the things that the government does is call the wolves by shooting from helicopters, and by also doing what they call Judas wolf. So Judas wolf, they'll catch a wolf, they'll color it, they'll send it back to its pack, and then they'll know where that wolf is and where the pack is, and then they'll shoot the whole pack. Uh, from the air. So the the thing that is not appreciated in that is one of the things is that when you kill a wolf, for example, say you take out the main male or female parent in that family, you disturb the teaching of the young how to properly hunt, and you actually increase the ability or increase the probability of those wolves taking sheep or other farm animals because they haven't
Right.
learned properly how to hunt, and also they don't have the support of a family. So it really disturbs the parental, the family nature of the pack by randomly killing these wolves.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And also just, again, like why science and data is so important to show why it's not even you're trying to do something. It's bad in one sense, in an emotional way, but then also in a scientific way you're not actually getting the results that you want. And there's more effectiveness that they've shown with non-lethal means that could help. I know that those are probably wild caribou, so I'm sure that gets into complications, but at least with obviously with farmers or herds or things like that, and they just for Colorado have now employed the uh, I don't know, range riders, they call them.
Yeah.
Made me want to move out to Colorado to get on that job, and you just ride horses all day and, just try to like scare them off. I'm like, wow, that sounds great. You see wolves on horseback and, non lethal methods to get them and get them away. And I feel like those are much better methods, and I'm sure also much cheaper than because right, they do these culls a lot of the times from helicopter.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you're completely right in saying that there's so much known now about how to increase the ability of humans to coexist with apex predators, particularly wolves. And there are lots of non-lethal approaches. And there's also ranchers, if it's proven that a wolf has depredated on one of their sheep or cattle, they also have the ability to for compensation. So people, I mean, I applaud all of those efforts, because the more we can find our way through to accepting these apex predators on our landscape, the better off ultimately we will all be. And they're struggling with that in Europe right now too. And so there are some areas where they're starting to implement culls because wolves are coming back. And there's other people who are working to really encourage the use of these non-lethal interventions.
Yeah, I saw a very interesting video online and how they're doing that actually in Africa with these lion lights, and this guy created this whole thing on reflecting lights when lions come to help protect the herd for the farmers there, and it's working really well. And obviously, you need to change those lights; they can't just be stagnant. Like they have to have a not like a you know set schedule. They have to, go off at different times to actually be effective. But to learn those things, and it's been very effective for them in regards to that. So, obviously these methods are proven, and like following the data that shows that is so important. And also it's just like that makes more sense to me. It also seems like these methods would be cheaper than flying up in a helicopter. I can't imagine how logistically that how expensive that is to fly it up each time for ammunition and all that stuff. It doesn't seem like it's really equal in that sense, even logistically.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. It is a different situation with a wild animal like a caribou. But unfortunately, one of the biggest threats to the mountain caribou is the degradation of their habitat, and that is human caused. And it's connected to climate change, it's connected to logging and mineral exploration, and the putting in of roads into these territories, which allow the wolves easier access into the caribou. So there
Right.
are things that could be done to protect the wolves and also protect the caribou. But the government has opted for this culling.
Yeah, the biggest thing I think with that, right, is these wildlife corridors, these wildlife paths that are be able to be accessible, because that's the biggest thing, is they don't have enough space to be able to run away from the wolves or protect themselves, which is what you're saying. And there's ways to mediate and meet in the middle, and the fact that most of the public don't want this anymore. So it's really your voice is important with speaking out about these things, like for people listening, like make sure you sign petitions, like those things really take traction and are very important, to show these things to people that um are in places of power to be able to change going for the future, because wolves also, people don't realize, they affect the soil and the healthy and the fertility of the soil, because of things like elk. There are too many elk or something eating the riverbeds. And if we want to have really healthy food and be able to grow and all that stuff, like we need these keystone species and predators to be able to affect change and to be able to, because we're not going to be able to effectively manage, that's that over managing wildlife of elk and deer and stuff the way that wolves do, because they only take the sick and the dying and um you know selection, natural selection, right?
Well, they do that. I mean, sometimes they take healthy animals, but they take just what
Sure.
they need. They take
Yeah.
what they need to survive, and it's minor compared to the populations often of an elk herd or deers. Deer are running a lot of areas in the country now, in into the urban areas
Yeah.
because well, for a few reasons. One, because we've degraded the habitat that they used to live in, and they're also finding a lot of yummy food in the gardens, and also if a predator comes in, we kill it. So they don't even have the predators. It's a safe area for them. So we have a lot to answer for as human beings. And what we do to the various habitats and ecosystems that we actually ourselves need to survive. So uh,
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those things that I feel really strongly about, passionate about, uh, is using Takaya's legacy to perhaps increase the understanding of the significance of the wolves and the apex predators, um, and of the value of our wilderness areas that we don't want to lose. We lose part of ourselves when we lose the wild spaces, even if we're not in them, even when he's not there in the islands, his presence is there. And, people who loved that when they wouldn't see him, they still said, it's made a difference how it feels to be in that place.
Yeah.
And we will find that we have hollowed out our world. Um, so even if physically we figure out how to create better ecosystems or maintain them, we're losing part of our spiritual connection with the wild world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you said it so beautifully. And then just, I guess, on like a lasting note for listeners, what else would you add to that they could do to help support Takaya's legacy and wolves? What would be your message to them?
Hell, my message is fight for the protection of habitat, wild habitat. That includes parks and protected areas. Advocate for your representatives. Sign petitions. Advocate that your representatives have as a priority the protection of parklands and the protection of conservancy areas. They're important, and a lot of your listeners probably and listeners around the world don't actually understand what is happening to our wildlife. So get that information out there, share the knowledge. And, right now, your parks, your parklands are under threat. Your park people are being fired, and the person who may be in charge of your wild lands and your public lands is not got the wildlife's best interests at heart.
Unfortunately not. No, yes.
I mean, I don't want to get political. That's not, I don't live in your country, but I would say get out there and make sure that your park and wild spaces have the protection they require.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because our connection to the wild, I think, is, like I said before, is innately spiritual. I know you agree, and like we need that wild place inside of us and in nature to be able to connect to that. I think that we're in a time where hopefully we can change these things with the more that science and data comes out to help support why those animals need to be there, especially predators, and to be able to understand their environmental value. I think outside of our own is just very important. So yeah. I agree.
No. Well, thank you for doing this work and the podcast, and encouraging people to find that place in their heart where the wild lives, and in not only your heart but actually in your whole body. We have a wild, there is something wild still about us, and we need to not lose that.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. And for people wanting to connect or to hear more about Takaya, where would they find you?
On Instagram, Takaya Lone Wolf. Takaya Lone Wolf, all one. There's takayaslegacy.com. If you want to see lots of the stuff about the art that has been created, there's a huge amount of stuff on that website. It's on Facebook as well, under the same thing as Instagram. Occasionally on TikTok. I'm not a big social media person, but I do.
Fair enough.
Someone who helps.
Yes.
And, and there is available the film that it actually won a Canadian Academy Award for Best Science Nature Documentary. It's Takaya Lone Wolf, and there's also the book I wrote, Takaya Lone Wolf, is also available probably in your country only through Amazon, maybe through some independent bookstores. And there's a couple kids' books, which are great for young children to encourage them to think about wolves and learn a little bit about them and be inspired.
Oh, I love that so much. I'll make sure to link all those things in the description below so they're a little easier for listeners to be able to access. But I really appreciate you coming on and taking the time and revisiting that story and sharing it with everybody. So thank you so much again.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Brianna, and I wish the best of the wild to all of us.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Wild Ones, for listening. And we'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
To the sea, I feel the energy of life force flowing all through me, and I'll allow it all to dance with my body and play, and no one could ever convince me to give my power away, 'cause the motion of the ocean, it fills my soul, and all the power of the flower of life, it moves me and it makes me whole, and the mountains so high and so deep, I feel in my bones, in the call of the wild's always bringing me home. 'cause there's nothing that I need to fear anymore. Yeah. Inside of every brother and sister,